Welcome to High Truths on Drugs and Addiction, where national experts bring you facts and answer your questions. I am your host, Dr. Ronit Lev, an emergency and addiction doctor who has served at the White House and still practices on the front lines. Right here on High Truths, you will learn from experts, hear stories from the emergency department, and listen to people who have struggled from addiction. Friends, fentanyl is plaguing America. It has infected all illicit drugs, from cocaine to meth, counterfeit pills, and even marijuana. If you're around someone who may be using drugs, you should carry naloxone, the opioid reversal agent. Carrying naloxone for drugs is like carrying an EpiPen for allergies. If you need a prescription for naloxone, you should have one. No questions asked. That is why I am offering a free prescription to anyone who needs one. Come visit me on hightruths.com to learn more about the show, submit a question, or download a free prescription for naloxone. And if you like the show, do me a favor. Give us a 5-star review and subscribe. Your stars are very much appreciated and go a long way in supporting the program. Today's episode is sponsored by Families Against Fentanyl. FAF is an organization set on breaking the status quo of failed solutions and to get to the core of the supply chain of deadly fentanyl. Learn more about FAF by visiting familiesagainstfentanyl.org and sign their petition to declare illegal fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction. Hello, everyone, and I am once again energized to share another enlightening High Truths conversation with you. I am your host, Dr. Ronit Lev. The question I pose for you today is, do we still have a war on drugs? Or perhaps we should just get over it and allow drugs to freely flow into our country with no limits. DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency, made headlines when they seized more than 2,200 pounds of methamphetamines in October 2021, the largest haul in the agency's history for methamphetamines. But that was not the largest drug seizure of all. Back in 2005, 13.8 tons of cocaine was interdicted on its way to the United States, and that was the largest seizure in the world in a single operation in a single day. How do you feel when you hear about news about a drug bust? Are you happy for the seizure? That's much less drugs available for abuse. Or do you feel sad for the dealer? Or perhaps you feel defeated, like, what's the difference anyway? Drug exchange can be violent. People say marijuana is just a plant, it's organic, it's healthy, but those plants are protected with machine guns and weapons. Other natural plants, organic tomatoes, for example, don't need machine guns. Marijuana is not a victimless drug. In September 2020, just outside San Diego in Riverside County, 7 people were shot and murdered in an illegal marijuana grow. Deputies found hundreds of marijuana plants and 1,000 pounds of processed marijuana valued at more than $5 million. This was from a professional crime cartel. All victims were Laotian, and the mystery remains on what cartel was involved. Who fights the supply of drugs? The DEA, Drug Enforcement Agency. The DEA was established in 1973, merging other agencies into a single agency tasked with the drug control activities. What do you think about investment in reducing the supply of drugs? How important is the role of law enforcement in our drug crisis? I like to use the infectious disease model, as you know. In order to eradicate malaria, we needed to get rid of the swamps. Sure, we developed medications that treated and prevented malaria, but getting rid of the swamps helped get rid of the disease. Remember the Zika virus? Getting a mosquito bite while pregnant meant risk of having a baby born without a brain, anencephaly. Pretty horrific. The treatment was mosquito control. People say we can't police our way or arrest our way out of the drug crisis. Maybe true, but I also don't think we can treat our way out of the drug crisis. Of course, treatment is important, but it's not the ultimate solution. It takes a balanced approach. The opioid prescription epidemic is a model. We ended this problem by decreasing the supply of prescription opioids, not just by increasing Suboxone treatment. So supply matters. It matters a lot. And we'll never have less kids using drugs when we increase the supply and access to marijuana. We won't have less fentanyl and methamphetamine when our supply chain grows. And with that, let's hear our question of the day.
My name is Ray Sweeney. I'm a chief of police out here in La Mesa, California. And over the last 20 plus years that I've been doing this job, I've seen a dramatic change in the way that law enforcement enforces and interacts with drug use on the street, from the legalization of marijuana to the decriminalization of some of the major drugs that has happened across California and other states nationally. I'm really excited to hear about your podcast, The High Truths on Drugs and Addiction, because it really affects us on a local level, and I'm sure it does on the national level. That's why my question for the DEA is, we've seen an increase in drug use and supply here locally in the streets. And with the decriminalization, that's made it more challenging for law enforcement to address those issues on the street. And I'm wondering if it's had any impact with the DEA, and if so, what are you doing to address that? Thank you.
Chief McSweeney, thank you so much for your question, and thank you for the service and keeping our community safe. To answer your question, I invited someone who is very much an expert in law enforcement and drug control, the previous acting administrator of DEA, Uttam Dhillon. Uttam Dhillon headed the DEA, where he led a workforce of 15,000 people and oversaw a budget of $3.2 million. Mr. Dhillon came to his position in DEA from being the director of INTERPOL Washington, where he acted as a U.S. official representative to the International Criminal Police Organization, INTERPOL, the world's largest police organization and its 194 member countries. Mr. Dhillon has a legal background and served as counsel to the president, associate deputy attorney general, and as a federal prosecutor. In 2006, Mr. Dhillon was unanimously confirmed by the United States Senate as the first director of the Office of Counter-Narcotics Enforcement at the Department of Homeland Security. He has significant congressional experience for the House Financial Services Committee, the House Select Committee on Homeland Security, and the House Committee on Government Reform and Oversight. He works in consulting and serves on various advisory boards. You can find Mr. Uttam Dhillon's bio on the High Truth show notes. Uttam Dhillon, welcome to High Truths.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you having me.
I'm very excited to have you here. And I don't know if you recall, we sat at table apart at a CADCA event in DC, and I approached you about DEA Take Back Day. I was very excited. I was very excited about my genius idea to take back vaping products during a vaping epidemic that preceded COVID. And I don't know if you remember that.
Well, I absolutely do. And I think you probably also know that shortly thereafter, we announced that we were taking back vaping products for the very first time.
Yep. Yeah, I'm proud of that. Sometimes you get like great ideas, and that's the beautiful thing about working in DC. When that happens, it goes nationwide to share. So,
yeah, well, I appreciate that. That made a big difference. Getting those vaping products is making those part of the Take Back Day was an important part of that Take Back Day.
And so for this episode, we have a call from and question from Chief Sweeney. He's chief of police in La Mesa, California. He was asking, what is DEA doing about the increased supply and increased use, especially now with the pandemic, as well as the whole decriminalization of drug use that makes the problem much worse?
Well, so I left DEA in May of 2020, but I can tell you that based upon my experience as the acting administrator of DEA, I know that the agents in the field offices are continuing to work very hard to ensure that drugs and drug traffickers are taken off the streets of America. That mission hasn't changed. That mission continues. With respect to decriminalization, you have to remember that a jurisdiction that may change its laws with respect to drugs, that's fine with respect to the state or county or city law, whatever law is being changed. But those laws will remain the same under federal law. And so DEA will continue to prosecute individuals who are engaging in illegal drug trafficking in violation of federal law. And it doesn't necessarily matter what the state laws are with respect to that.
And that's important differentiation, which keeps people in localities kind of confused because they don't know what's what.
It can be confusing, especially in states where, certain drugs could be legalized, but under federal law, they're still illegal. But under federal law, DEA can investigate and seek the prosecution of individuals who are, trafficking in those illegal drugs, regardless of the legal status in the locality where those drugs are.
So let's talk a little bit about like the whole philosophy of drugs. Do we still have this war on drugs?
Well, the phrase "war on drugs" has gotten a bad rap because people imagine that at some point you win a war and it's over. But what I would tell people is, we haven't stopped prosecuting bank robbery cases. I was a federal prosecutor in Los Angeles in the 90s, and the very first case I got was a bank robbery case. And we've been seeing bank robbery cases since there have been banks for hundreds and hundreds of years. If we had called it a war on bank robbery from the very first day, well, we would have lost that war because people still rob banks. So we really have to think of this as just an ongoing criminal activity that's a part of society and that's going to continue. Our job, our goal is to push down as much of that as possible, to reduce it to the bare minimum that we can. And we do that by seizing as many drugs as we can, getting those drugs off the street. We do that by arresting the drug traffickers and prosecuting them. And we do that by seeking the highest sentences possible for drug traffickers to create a disincentive for others to engage in that trafficking and to get the drug traffickers off the street. That's our goal.
Hearing you say that makes me think of something exactly along those lines, medically related. We had a war on cancer and a battle of cancer and somebody who lost their battle or won their battle. And that's really unfair to people who have cancer, because then just like you said, we'll always lose. Somebody will always lose. And so I think we're coming away from calling that a battle on cancer and medical issues. And I think the same analogy goes for drugs, hearing you say that. The other common thing that we hear is we can't arrest our way out of using drugs. And what's your thoughts on that?
Well, that's kind of a similar to the war on drugs. You can't win that war. The answer is that attacking the drug problem in the United States requires a global kind of approach. You need prevention, treatment, and enforcement. You're not going to win this battle with prevention only, with treatment only, or enforcement only. You have to bring all three of those together to attack the problem. But enforcement is a critical part of that because enforcement goes after supply. And one of the things we've learned in the opioid crisis is that supply matters. And the best example I can give you is everyone's heard the story about that small town in West Virginia where prescription opioids flooded this town, and suddenly the addiction rates went way up. Well, they went up because they had supply. They had those opioids available to them. That's the best evidence, I think, that supply really does make a difference. So what DEA does and what all law enforcement does is they attack the supply problem. They attack the drugs, the drug traffickers bringing drugs into our country. They take the drugs off the street and they reduce supply. So it's absolutely critical that you have that law enforcement component. And I would also say that one of the things we need to think about is how many resources we're giving our law enforcement. If you just think of one cartel, one Mexican drug cartel literally makes billions of dollars a year. DEA's budget when I left was only a few $1 billion, $3 billion, I think, per year. That may sound like a lot, but DEA has a global law enforcement mission. It's in countries throughout the world. And so it needs the resources, and other law enforcement needs the resources to aggressively attack this problem.
And you're so right. The other people who say that, Sam Quinones, who is on High Truths, talked about in his new book, The Least of Us, how supply matters. It matters a lot. And you give a perfect example for that. I actually think that the opioid prescription epidemic is over, and it was over by managing the supply. It's not over by prescribing our way with buprenorphine out of it. Right. So yeah, I think that's a perfect example.
Absolutely. One of the things that I'm proud occurred when I was the acting administrator is we actually saw overdose deaths go down briefly for the first time in decades. And part of the reason for that was that DEA, working with HHS and others, helped to educate doctors about just simply overprescribing. And when we saw those prescription rates drop by fairly significant amounts, we saw drug overdose deaths drop as a result of prescription opioids drop. So the answer is, when you reduce supply, you really will see a tangible benefit. And we have the proof of that. That occurred just a few years ago.
Right. And to defend the medical community, I would say that prescribing was pushed on us. If we didn't prescribe, we were not considered compassionate. Laws were passed that, about the pain as a right, pain as a fifth vital signs. And there was a period of time where if you didn't prescribe and didn't give opioids, you were considered a bad doctor. Then things change, and it's always hard to re-educate anything.
Well, I was told the doctors just in medical school, this is not something you're necessarily taught. And so that was one of the issues. But I think it's also really important for doctors not to underprescribe. I mean, opioids, if a patient needs it, and the doctor thinks the patient needs it, there shouldn't be a hesitation to providing a necessary medication. This is overprescribing. And we don't want, when I was the acting administrator, one of the things I never wanted was to know that somebody was suffering needlessly because a doctor feared prescribing because they feared repercussions. That was something that always worried me. And I think it's really important to find that. It's a hard balance, but it's a balance we have to find together.
I agree. I call it Goldilocks prescribing, not too much, not too little. It has to be just right. And frankly, government should be out of the business of the doctor-patient relationship, because that interference caused the opioid prescription epidemic in the first place. Laws were passed that pushed prescribing, that took away triplicate prescriptions, that opened the door and took out the speed bumps for prescribing anything to anybody for any condition. And then we suffered the consequences of that. There are organizations, though, that have a different philosophy about drugs. For example, the Drug Policy Alliance is an organization that strives to normalize drugs, a philosophy I don't agree with, but they've called for dismantling the DEA, a waste of time, mass incarceration, abuse of authority, blocking research, other, pretty dramatic things. I'm sure you've faced this type of criticism. What's your response?
Look, right now we're facing an overdose crisis like we've never experienced before. Last year, we lost over 100,000 Americans to drug poisoning. DEA's mission is now more critical than ever. Those drug poisonings are almost largely the result of Mexican drug trafficking organizations pouring their illegal drugs into the United States. The only law enforcement agency that can effectively go against those drug trafficking organizations is the Drug Enforcement Administration. The notion of dismantling DEA now would guarantee that those drug trafficking organizations will not just continue to poison our citizens, but will poison even more every single year. It'll also guarantee that these drug trafficking organizations, which are already global, will truly become global criminal organizations capable of doing enormous damage to not just the United States, but to the rest of the world. Honestly, DEA is the only law enforcement organization in the world standing between those global drug trafficking organizations and the safety and security of our citizens.
Wow. So I guess if you believe in freedom of using drugs and freedom of cartels, you'd agree with the DPA. But if you want to protect the brain of youth, decreasing addiction, and protecting our country, really, then you'd be in favor of decreasing the supply of drugs and supporting the DEA.
Absolutely. I mean, again, the way I look at it is we're losing 100,000 Americans a year, and that's directly. You can draw a direct line from those drug overdoses to these drug cartels in Mexico. I mean, they're killing our citizens at an alarming rate. We can't disarm ourselves now. We need to actually increase our law enforcement efforts to more aggressively attack these organizations.
I agree. And talking about this during a pandemic where this little invisible virus is killing people, here's something that's killing. Actually, more people die of fentanyl than COVID in age 18 to 45. And we're not treating that as aggressively and as we should. as COVID. What about, you mentioned about supply? Where are drugs coming from? Are they coming from China, Mexico, Canada? Where are the efforts that need to be made?
Yeah, so largely most of the illegal drugs entering the U.S. are coming from Mexican drug trafficking organizations like the Sinaloa cartel, for example. They get their drugs from a variety of places. So we're talking about fentanyl mostly because the vast majority of drug overdose deaths are related to fentanyl now. But let's not forget, these cartels are also bringing heroin into the country. Cocaine is still killing a lot of Americans. Methamphetamine, just a few years ago, meth was really killing more folks. It still is killing a lot of Americans. These drug trafficking organizations are bringing all of these drugs from Mexico into the United States. They receive what they call precursor chemicals. Those are the chemicals they use to manufacture methamphetamine and fentanyl in Mexico. They receive a majority of those chemicals from China, some from India, and some from other countries. So they're able to take those chemicals, create these synthetic drugs in Mexico, and then transport those drugs across the border into the United States.
And so what are we doing about those precursors? Are we going to India and China to block it at that end before it gets to Mexico and get assembled? Sure.
During the previous administration, I worked with the drug czar, the Office of National Drug Control Policy, and actually went to China. Jim Carroll, that's
Our
right.
Friend, yeah.
And actually went to China to talk to the Chinese law enforcement about the precursor chemicals. Jim Carroll did too. And we were largely effective in that the Chinese recognized that there was a problem with these precursor chemicals coming into the United States and into Mexico. However, the chemicals continue to flow through illegal sources from China and from other countries, including India. So the answer is there needs to be very, very strong and continuous diplomacy with those countries and law enforcement efforts with those countries to stop the chemicals from ever leaving those countries and getting into Mexico or any place else where they're manufacturing these drugs. Those efforts were continuing under the Trump administration, and they need to continue very much under the Biden administration.
And do you know if they are continuing now?
I can't say that they are. I would just say based upon what we're seeing today, the amount of drugs entering the country every day, almost every day there's an article about a new, very large seizure. Just a few years ago, the amount of fentanyl that was being seized at the border was just minuscule. I mean, it really was a very small amount. Yeah. Now it's massive compared to that. And so just based upon that evidence of seizures is good because it tells us we're taking more drugs off the street. Every drug we take off the street saves a life. But what also tells us is, since we always only get just a portion of the drugs, that if those numbers go up, the seizure numbers go up, the amount of drugs coming into the country are actually larger. So just based on that evidence, I would say that China, India, and other countries that should be working with us to keep the precursor chemicals from going to the Mexican drug cartels, that is not being effective.
You know, you make a good point that we just catch a small amount. It's just what we catch. It tells us what's coming in. Do you have an estimate of the percentage? What percentage do we catch? That to give us an estimate of the global amount that's in.
So it's impossible to know what we don't know. Yeah. I would say right now it's really hard to estimate that because you don't have. So drugs enter the country through ports of entry. And they also enter between ports of entry. And that's like in some places, that's the desert or that's across a river or something like that between the US and Mexico. Mm-hmm. So normally you have Border Patrol agents, for example, between the ports of entry. You have Customs and Border Protection at the ports of entry. Right now, because Border Patrol is dealing with so many immigrants coming from Mexico, between the ports of entry are often unguarded. And so my best guess is that we're probably seeing a lot more drugs coming up between the ports of entry than we did just a year or so ago. And of course, we're still seeing an enormous amount of drugs coming through the port of entry. So the bottom line is the whole system is sort of breaking down to allow drug traffickers to bring drugs through in a number of different ways where it's become easier to do so.
And sadly, we're suffering the consequences of that, and seeing that in our morgues. That's very sad. What are some of the creative ways you've encountered in the way people smuggle drugs? Like I was amused. I guess I shouldn't say amused, but pictures of burritos with fentanyl in them that were smuggled across.
Yeah, I mean, look, drug traffickers are amazingly creative. Let's not forget that they're a criminal enterprise with literally billions of dollars to work with. So they have the time and the capability to develop all sorts of technology, complex and very simple. So through ports of entry, the way they want to get the drugs through is in a vehicle. And so you'll see things like batteries that are where only half the battery is actually a battery and the other half is a storage container for drugs. So that if somebody were to test the battery, you would still get a charge off of it. It would still look like a battery and that sort of thing, but you could put drugs in it. Within tires, within all parts of a vehicle, building things to look like part of a vehicle, but aren't. Customs and Border Protection detects that by putting those vehicles through an X-ray, but they don't have enough of those machines to do that. And it's actually a very labor-intensive job. You need somebody who's an expert at this, who can look at an X-ray of a vehicle and see an anomaly, pick that out, and figure out where the drugs are. We need to develop technologies that can do that more efficiently, artificial intelligence and the like, that can pick up that information. We also need the ability to pretty much scan every single vehicle coming into the US. If we had the ability to scan every vehicle this way coming into the US and an artificial intelligence capability to see the anomalies in a vehicle, we would be able to decrease the amount of drugs entering the country by a fairly significant amount.
Yeah, it's amazing we don't do that more often. I did tour the border entry at Baltimore when I was in DC and got to see the CAT scans in the vehicles. And it's like, behind door number 3, this car has packages. And they don't screen every car. They have artificial intelligence and they look at the inventory and something that doesn't seem right, they X-rays or CAT scan those. Which is interesting, but you're right. You can't, and you do that in the U.S. post offices and boats and other, just like you said, a lot of their creative way.
Well, very close to where you're at is the port of entry. It's just in San Ysidro, and that's one of the busiest ports of entry in the country. And it is just not possible for them to maintain commerce and all of that to scan every vehicle in the way we described. And so that's where the Customs and Border Protection officers need to use their instincts and their training to identify individuals who are bringing drugs across the border, to put them into secondary so they can do a more thorough inspection. But that's, again, a very, unfortunately, very hit and miss. Drug trafficking organizations recognize that they're going to lose a certain amount of drugs crossing the border. So
part of doing business.
So they'll send, let's say, 5 vehicles across the border with fentanyl hidden in a secret compartment and know that they'll lose one of them. That's fine. They're going to make so much money off of the 4 vehicles that got through that the amount of money they're losing on the one vehicle that gets caught is de minimis.
Yeah. And their creativity is not just in how to smuggle, but also how to make new drugs, right? And there's a whole movement that you'll tell us about now about moving to synthetic drugs versus agricultural and various creative ways in making those chemicals.
Right. So this is a huge danger for us. And we saw this with methamphetamine. Methamphetamine is a synthetic drug. It's manufactured by drug cartels in Mexico. When I was the acting administrator, I had the opportunity to visit a meth so-called super lab in Sinaloa, and it was quite amazing. I mean, they flew us in a helicopter to the middle of a jungle where this lab was manufacturing methamphetamine. By the way, polluting the environment because these drug traffickers couldn't care less. There was a small river nearby that was obviously being polluted as they poured the chemicals in there. And so they have the ability to manufacture these without worrying about the growing cycle. So heroin is a product of a crop that you have to grow and water and tend to. You have to cultivate it, then you have to, cut it down. You have to process it. There's a cycle to that. It's expensive. It's labor intensive. It takes time. Methamphetamine and fentanyl, which is a synthetic opioid, doesn't require any of that. You manufacture that in a laboratory. So the cycle isn't months, it's weeks to get that done. And so the danger is, it really is, the traffickers can manufacture and distribute an infinite supply, as much as they're only limited by their manufacturing facilities. And I think what we're seeing now is the drug traffickers moving away from heroin, because it's just really more expensive and more subject to the vagaries of a crop, and to fentanyl, because it is simply more powerful, more potent. Less of it gives you creates a higher has higher potency, and therefore less of it is more profitable.
Yeah. Why wait for your crops to come and agriculture when you could just make it in a little lab that you could move around also?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So as far as synthetics, so there's, we're talking about, fentanyl is synthetic drug and the methamphetamine is synthetic. There's also synthetic marijuana spice that's illegal federally, but also other ways of like the Delta 8s and 9s that are coming in there. Is that under anybody's radar?
Absolutely. And I think if I understand you correctly, when we talk about synthetic marijuana, it's not really marijuana. It's just another kind of a drug that is called marijuana or synthetic
like
marijuana.
Spice or K2, where the core chemical of it is like the cannabis molecule, but then they change it around. Right. Just like the fentanyl analogs are made differently, and the cannabis molecule is made differently.
Absolutely. When I was at DEA, we were definitely focusing on that, and focusing on. There's also that's part of the extraction process where THC is extracted from marijuana, which, by the way, can be very dangerous. People blow themselves up. They create a lot of it's a toxic environment and that sort of thing. But yes,
and people die from that high concentration. Right. Yeah.
Right. People don't. One of the things that people don't fully appreciate is that marijuana naturally doesn't have THC that high, but people have been now changing that so that the THC levels are going up and up. And then when people extract that and then put it in a very high concentration, nobody's ever tested that on human beings. And so the results it's a very dangerous thing to do. I would urge people not to do that.
I see the test results because they come to the emergency department. It's not good. In one of our episodes with Libby Stute, who's a psychiatrist in Colorado, she very eloquently says that the high potency, the very high potency THC is more like methamphetamine. People behave in that way rather than what people think of marijuana.
It's really critical that we do that there be research on that, because I think people think because it's THC and extracted from marijuana, it's safe, but it's such high potency. We just don't know what it's going to do to people. And I think I've seen studies showing at least some brain damage to young people who use high potency,
and increased addiction and associations with psychosis that could become permanent. The marijuana plant that not only just affects people's brain, it's affecting our lands, and just there's huge amounts of public lands that are being used by these cartels to grow marijuana, poisoning our land, poisoning endangered species. It's estimated that the amount of money to clean that up is more than cleaning up an oil spill. And later on, I will have a podcast with an ecologist who will talk to us about that. But is DEA working on protecting our public lands from this kind of contamination?
Certainly, when I was administrator, I assume that continues. I will say I had the opportunity to visit one of these illegal grows in California. And what we're talking about here is drug cartels will take over a piece of land, national forest or a state forest in a very remote area. They'll find a location. Oftentimes it's very slopey and mountainous, where they have access to water, and they will grow marijuana, and they will use fertilizers that are actually illegal or banned in the United States. They will get illegal fertilizers.
Pesticides.
Pardon me?
Pesticides.
Yes. I mean, basically what they're doing is these are and pesticides. You're correct. Fertilizers and pesticides that are illegal in the US, and they'll poison our environment. They'll poison our water supply. They're also stealing water. So water up in California always has water issues. So, up in the mountains where the water is coming from, they'll divert enormous amounts of water to feed marijuana plants. Marijuana plants actually require a tremendous amount of water. So they're taking water to feed the plants. They're poisoning the environment. Animals that eat this marijuana become those pesticides and fertilizers and the like get into their system. So anybody who was actually maybe hunting those would and eating them afterwards would discover that they're actually eating all of these things that are banned in the US, but they're being brought illegally here. So these illegal grows are really terrible for the environment. And it's one of the things that DEA was focusing on, but it's something that people need to understand is happening. This is not without cost.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about drug scheduling. I'm a physician. Every 3 years, I pay DEA $731 for the privilege of prescribing medications. And can you talk a little bit about rescheduling certain medications? So, for example, gabapentin is not on the schedule, and yet when I review medical examiner data of what people die from, that's high on the list.
So, look, there's a whole process for that. DEA works with HHS. And so there is a process for scheduling that requires, scheduling is done based upon a review of the particular drug, and that's not done by DEA. That's done by others at HHS. And then once they've drawn their conclusion, for example, something that's in Schedule 1, which means there's no medical use, if they draw a conclusion that a particular drug fits into that category, then they make a recommendation, and there's a whole regulatory process to make that happen. But when it comes to scheduling, there's something else I'd like to mention. Mm-hmm. There's something called emergency scheduling, where DEA can decide on its own to put something on the schedule of drugs, of illegal drugs, on an emergency basis. And DEA did that several years ago with respect to fentanyl analogs. Now, fentanyl analogs, as you know, but let me just say for your audience, are fentanyl-like drugs. They're drugs that are like fentanyl, but something in them has been slightly molecularly changed. So they're not exactly fentanyl. And the scheduling works based on the molecular structure of the drug. So if you create an analog that gives you the same effect as fentanyl, but it's not covered by the schedule, then it's harder for us to prosecute drug traffickers trafficking in that analog. So a few years ago, DEA saw that drug traffickers were making these analogs because they were trying to evade prosecution. And so DEA emergency scheduled those analogs. And that scheduling expired several years ago. And since then, Congress has been doing temporary rescheduling of these analogs. That's going to expire, I believe, February 18th. And so this is a big deal. And I'm surprised that Congress hasn't been able to just do the emergency scheduling, given the fentanyl crisis, the overdose crisis we're facing today. But I think it's just important to recognize that if these fentanyl analogs are not scheduled, permanently scheduled, drug trafficking organizations will be able to create these analogs, and it will be much, much harder to prosecute drug traffickers who traffic in these fentanyl analogs, which basically is going to mean that we will be flooded with fentanyl analogs, and it'll be very difficult, if not impossible, to prosecute the individuals killing our citizens with these drugs.
So emergency scheduling is only done by Congress. DEA cannot act on that alone.
No, DEA has emergency scheduling authority, which I believe goes for 2 years. But once that period is ended, DEA cannot redo it. Congress has to do it. So the regulatory scheme is it's an emergency. DEA can use this emergency authority that it's been given to do the temporary scheduling. And during that period of time, then, if the drugs need to be permanently scheduled, you can go through the normal process of scheduling them and getting them on during the 2 years, or Congress could act to schedule them. But you have to remember, scheduling a single drug can take itself years. And so, if you require the federal government to go through the process of scheduling every single analog, that means going through the whole testing process that we have to go through. And all the traffickers have to do every time we schedule something is change it a little bit again. And then we have to go through a process that'll take potentially, if not months, years to do. That's why the permanent scheduling is so critical, because that just takes the ability of the traffickers to change the drug and to avoid scheduling, takes it completely out of the picture. And I'm hoping that Congress will act to permanently schedule on before the deadline of February 18th.
And that's to do all the analogs, all the fentanyl. All the
analogs, yes. Would just be I think the legislation is a little different from, it's changed from time to time. But the bottom line is this: fentanyl and any of its analogs would be scheduled.
Right. And I don't know if there's any of those fentanyls that say have a medicinal value that they wouldn't want to be in a Scheduled 1 and keep them as a Schedule 2 like fentanyl is.
Right, exactly. And look, there's a process. That's been one of the concerns. If you schedule everything, are you taking out a potential useful drug? The answer is, remember, DEA does authorize research on Schedule 1 drugs. So if a pharmaceutical company or a university doing research decided that this particular fentanyl analog had some potential medical value, they would simply apply to DEA so that they can do research on that Schedule 1 drug. And if they can demonstrate that it does have some useful purpose, then you go through the normal process and it gets scheduled into an appropriate place, Schedule 2 or Schedule 3 or wherever.
Right. But at this point in time, 2022, with 100,000 people dying, a whole airplane a day of people dying from drugs, I don't see the benefit of keeping those doors open. I think we need to close the doors and then make exceptions instead of the other way around.
You're absolutely right. It would be, I'm trying to search for the right word, crazy to let the scheduling expire. It would be truly a disaster.
For devastating. Our country. What about, so we're talking about scheduling, there's a whole controversy about, like, should marijuana be on the schedule, should be legalized federally? If any of those things happen, whether it becomes legalized on a federal level or scheduled on a federal level, how would that change what DEA does and approach to marijuana?
Well, if there was a decision to change the scheduling, it would no longer be a Schedule 1 drug. So that would change how it's enforced. It would be, if it was moved to Schedule 2, for example, then it would be like fentanyl, as we've talked about, which has a useful medical purpose. If somebody finds that marijuana does have that. So that would change how it's dealt with. One of the things that I should mention, though, is I was talking about the illegal grow in California. One of the things we've seen, and policymakers need to very seriously consider and think about, is as states have legalized marijuana, and states do it in various forms, sometimes for medicinal, sometimes for recreational. There's a whole patchwork of ways states have done this. By doing that, they've also created a very lucrative black market for marijuana. So almost every state where it's been legalized in some form or another has a taxing scheme for marijuana and that sort of thing. Not surprisingly, the drug traffickers use the ability to now grow marijuana more freely in those states because it's legal, but they don't go through any of the process of paying taxes and business licenses and that sort of thing. And the end result is their marijuana is cheaper than legal marijuana. And so you see in places like Colorado, where marijuana has been legal for quite some time, thriving black markets, thriving criminal enterprises engaging in the illegal marijuana trade. And that's something that policymakers need to think about. And I feel like as people talk about what we do with marijuana, people don't talk about the fact that legalization has actually created this very large market of illegal marijuana to evade all the regulations that relate to legal marijuana. That's just one issue that people need to think about as they think about the marijuana issue.
Right. And that happened with, cigarettes, right? With the fake, unregulated cigarettes.
The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms and Explosives to this day still, tracks illegal cigarettes that haven't been taxed properly, don't have the tax stamp on them, because that obviously the tax is an additional cost, and people are looking for on the black market want to get something cheaper. So yes, you see that with all sorts of products, regulated products like that. And it's important that you have a regulatory scheme that can deal with that. Right now, we don't. And what we see, and I think in places like California, the so-called legal distributors are complaining bitterly about being completely undercut by not only the extraordinary regulation that exists and the hurdles for them to do business, but also the black market is just totally undercutting them in California.
Right. And so they're asking for tax breaks, which is also weird because there's so many other businesses who are not getting the breaks. And why would marijuana get a break? It's an interesting dynamic. Let's talk about DEA and doctors. How do doctors get in trouble with the DEA?
Well, there's a couple ways doctors can get in trouble with the DEA. What I mostly saw was doctors that were overprescribing. And we talked a little bit about overprescribing earlier, and I want to be really clear about this because I think doctors have a high sense of paranoia about DEA and prescribing practices. I never saw a doctor that was brought. So there's a whole process in DEA. If doctors have to, they're called registrants. You have to register with DEA, as you know, to be able to prescribe these.
I'm one of them. Yeah, I'm on your list.
Yes, and so we would see. And as the any administrator or an acting administrator is the final arbiter of whether to how a doctor's registration should be treated, whether it should be taken away, whether it should be suspended, that sort of thing, if they've engaged in some sort of activity that's inconsistent with their registration. What I saw were doctors where they were just very clear cases of abuse, of overprescribing, of engaging in illegal activity, of basically selling prescriptions and that sort of thing. That's what DEA was focused on when I was there. We wanted to be sure that we were getting rid of the truly bad apples, the ones who were literally using their medical degrees and their registrations to be drug traffickers. And that's different from a doctor who might be working at a pain clinic who has to prescribe a lot of painkillers, opioids, because all of his or her patients are in pain. And so that doctor would have a much higher percentage of those kinds of prescriptions than maybe your average general practitioner. But that doctor wouldn't have to worry about being under DEA's radar, because as long as they're following their normal practices and procedures, they would be fine. So DEA is not looking at, when I was there, DEA was certainly not looking at, regular doctors engaging in their regular practices. We were looking for the bad apples who were engaged in genuine criminal activity. Right.
The dirty doctors who make the rest of us look bad.
Absolutely.
But the other thing I know you did with ONDCP and previous administration is getting rid of the X waiver and allowing people to prescribe buprenorphine. I was there and really lobbied. I said, we had a new pandemic of COVID. We didn't know what we're doing. We didn't need to sit and take 8 hours of education to treat people with this virus, but yet treating people with addiction had all these barriers. And you got rid of that. Biden administration put that back in, took away the education. But to this day, right now, I still have to register with the government before treating somebody with addiction. I don't have to register with the government to treat somebody with COVID. Is that how's the DEA approaching the X waiver?
So when I was there, the goal was to make it as easy as possible for people to get the treatment they need. So there is a balance, because the drugs that are being prescribed are controlled substances. People can become addicted to those. Those can be misused. But in my view, creating an environment where doctors and patients make the decisions together, and doctors have the ability to judge the patient and then to prescribe what the patient needs in a situation where a patient is addicted and the doctor's helping the patient get off of addiction, getting the government as much out of that as possible is absolutely critical. And if we're moving away from that, I hope that will change and we'll move back toward that. if somebody is in addiction, and I'm not an addiction expert, I'm a law enforcement guy. So I'm now speaking a little bit out of my realm, more in your realm than mine. But my understanding is if somebody is in that environment, if they're in addiction, if they're addicted, and they're communicating with a healthcare professional, the last thing you want to do is to say, well, let me get back to you in a week. You need to be able to treat that patient in real time. As quickly and efficiently as possible. And so my goal was, and it would always be my goal, to ensure that no government entity is getting in the way of that, especially since people often have to go through treatment more than once. So you just want to make it as efficient and effective as possible.
Do you know of physicians who got in trouble with DEA for prescribing buprenorphine? Has that ever happened?
I can't tell you that I know of that occurring. Yeah. I'm not saying it didn't. It's not something that I can recall.
It's just interesting that, I can give morphine and Vicodin, oxycodone, and fentanyl without registering with the government extra. But I do if I prescribe buprenorphine. It's a little backwards. It's
definitely something that needs to be addressed.
And we're talking about other ways of doctors getting in trouble. I have to, I guess, I don't sarcastically laugh, that if I say the word ivermectin, which is, not approved treatment for COVID, but if I say anything about that, I could lose my license and be sanctioned. But if I can recommend marijuana for almost any disease process, and that's okay. Do doctors get in trouble for recommending or prescribing marijuana that's considered to be a Scheduled I drug? By the way, I want to make sure that people know that I can write a prescription legally without getting in trouble for Marinol, which is THC, or Epidiolex, which is CBD. That's gone through FDA processing. But I'm talking about the plant that they sell in dispensaries. Have physicians gotten in trouble for that?
Well, so I'm going to answer that with two different answers. One is I never saw that when I was at DEA, but it's also important to recognize something. DEA focuses on large-scale drug trafficking organizations. Okay. So when it comes to marijuana, DEA is focusing on, for example, the drug row we talked about, something that could only exist in a national forest because a large-scale drug trafficking organization has the resources and the ability to do that. That's what DEA's focus is. And the reason DEA is the one focuses in that manner is because it's difficult for local law enforcement, for example, to conduct an investigation that might take them to a Mexican cartel or all the way to Colombia, for example, for cocaine, or might take them from California to New York. DEA is a national law enforcement agency and an international law enforcement agency. And so those resources are focused on large-scale, global, or international drug trafficking organizations. So when you talk about, marijuana, and people often imagine that DEA is focused on some sort of somebody selling marijuana on the street or whatever. That is not what DEA does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're at the higher end of the global market, not on the micro end.
Correct.
Let's talk about some grand solutions to the drug problem, especially fentanyl. You and I both serve on the advisory board for Families Against Fentanyl. And thank you, Families Against Fentanyl, for sponsoring this podcast and fighting a very important cause for decreasing the deadly supply of fentanyl that's poisoning and killing our citizens. And one of the goals for Families Against Fentanyl is, again, going on the macro level, like you mentioned, by declaring fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction. Can you explain that? Why is that important? What would that do? What would that take?
Well, that could be via executive order of the president, simply declaring that fentanyl is a weapon of mass destruction and directing federal law enforcement components, entities, agencies to attack fentanyl trafficking in a coordinated way. It's important for a few reasons. First, it would send a very strong message to the drug cartels that we believe that killing tens of thousands of our citizens every year with fentanyl is, in fact, a weapon. We are, in fact, viewing it as a weapon of mass destruction. And we are viewing you as purveyors of that weapon of mass destruction. It would help coordinate resources like DOD resources, Department of Defense, ensure that Homeland Security and DOJ and the Department of State, they all have resources that focus on counter drug efforts. The president could order that they be brought together to more cohesively and effectively attack drug trafficking in Mexico and throughout the world. So it would have a very positive effect, both in terms of sending a very strong message, as well as a practical effort in terms of bringing together those government entities that could more effectively attack drug traffickers that are bringing fentanyl into the United States.
And one of the ways to accomplish that is for an executive order. Is there other ways to get that done?
Sure. Congress could act. Congress could do it through a resolution, for example. The House or the Senate could pass a resolution. There could be legislation. There are a number of ways of doing this, but I think the goal of Families Against Fentanyl is to raise that profile and get that energy directed at attacking the fentanyl problem. It is a desire for a recognition of the number of people that are dying every single day from these fentanyl overdoses, and a recognition that the large amount of fentanyl that's killing these folks, the majority of it that's killing these folks, is coming from these Mexican drug trafficking organizations. And we need to acknowledge that, and we need to aggressively attack these organizations.
And Jim Rowell, who started Families Against Fentanyl, lost his son, Tommy, and he was able to trace the fentanyl that his son bought to China and suing the organization from China that killed his son. And would that be easier if fentanyl was declared a weapon of mass destruction?
I don't know if that would. I don't know how that would impact, litigation, but I think that, again, it would send an important message to the Chinese, also to the Indians who are, sending precursor chemicals to these drug trafficking organizations, that the U.S. is viewing fentanyl in a much different way. A weapon of mass destruction is something that is capable of killing, many people at one time. Fentanyl's doing that. And every single day.
Right. So, like we said, more than COVID, it meets that definition, right?
So if we look at the number of people that die every day, the number of people that are dying every year from fentanyl, if that was anything else, I think this country would be going absolutely crazy over it. Yet we just don't seem to be as focused on it. We almost, I hate to say, and I hope this isn't true, are we beginning to accept this? I pray that we're not, but I think it's just critical for everybody in government to make this point. And what Families Against Fentanyl is seeking is that declaration of war against fentanyl. And it can be done through an executive order by the president, and that I think would be a very important next step as we fight these drug cartels.
Yeah, if anybody is listening and wants to join that effort, they can sign the petition that Families Against Fentanyl has on their website. And maybe the problem is that, I don't know if it is that, well, okay, you want fentanyl to be a weapon of mass destruction. That sounds more like a nuclear war kind of effort, or some uranium that should be a weapon of mass destruction. How is fentanyl different, and why fentanyl and not methamphetamine or cocaine or other drugs?
Well, right now, fentanyl is just taking more lives. I mean, more people are dying from opioid overdoses than anything else. But look, as a former DEA administrator, let me tell you, methamphetamine worries me too. Meth kills people a bit more slowly, but it kills an awful lot of people in this country. And so does cocaine. When I was a prosecutor in the 90s, cocaine was the big thing. Crack cocaine is what we were going after. We were focused on the cartels in South America that were growing and distributing cocaine. It's still killing a lot of people. We can't lose sight of any of these drugs, and the fact that all of them are part of criminal enterprises that are poisoning our citizens, killing our citizens, all to make money. That's what this is all about. All it's about for them is profit. And we've got to come to grips with that. And we've got to treat them like they're treating us. We've got to go after them with the same vigor that they go after us, and they go after dollars in this country.
Right. That's very sad. Follow the money. And unfortunately, we are a well-to-do country. And so that means that we have a bigger, more money to spend on drugs as well.
Right. We're the largest consumer of opioids in the world.
Yeah, sadly. I want to share one project that you've probably heard about, but I wanted to think of what can I do as a doctor to help with the fentanyl crisis. I'm not going to be able to create the weapon of mass destruction, which is really fighting the problem at its core. But how can the medical community be more involved and engaged in the issue is, I think, through data. That's how we operate as medical professionals. And we don't have that data. Most hospitals across America, if they get a drug screen on a patient, they'll get the federal five drugs, THC, PCP, amphetamines, and I don't know, I'm not thinking of those 5 right now, but it doesn't include fentanyl. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that's not included. So I thought what I think we could do is make the federal 5 the federal 6 and include that in drug screens. And so we have a very first law in that it's not a law, it's a bill in California, SB 862, Tyler's Law, that will require all hospitals that if they do a drug screen for these other drugs, it should include fentanyl.
That's a great idea. I guess I'm surprised that that's not already occurring. And that would actually give us useful data that I guess we're not getting, which is, would help to supplement our data about fentanyl use in this country. So
yeah,
that's a great idea.
Thank you. And I think Families Against Fentanyl will support that. I'm excited. It's my very first time introducing anything like that. And I think it's more than data because that data translates to action, right? If you have a positive drug screen, I like to say we could do contact tracing for overdoses, just like we do contact tracing for COVID or other infectious diseases. For every person who overdoses, there's other people who are affected. It's a teachable moment. If we don't know that that's what happened and show that happened, we can't act upon it. So I'm excited about that.
Well, congratulations.
I want to ask you about your experience as the head of the DEA. I mean, what a remarkable experience. Very large, high profile agency, toughest, really tough challenges. Looking back at your time there, what was your most rewarding? I want to ask you about your most rewarding and challenging experiences.
Most rewarding, I think, was the opportunity to meet the agents in the field who were doing their jobs. I got to go to Afghanistan to meet the agents there, and personnel, not just agents. I mean, the analysts and others working there, and that is was not the most glamorous place to be. Yet I found people who were so dedicated to the job, who loved the mission so much, who had done multiple tours there. It was just hugely rewarding to see their dedication to working with the law enforcement there to fight drug trafficking on a global scale. And I don't think people really imagine or think about the fact that we've got people in all over the world in places like that sacrificing every day to try to make America safe. So that was the best part of the job, meeting people like that.
And challenging?
The challenge, when I first got there, what I discovered was that the number of agents had decreased over the last few years. So, the agents are the ones that are making the cases, that are doing the arrests, that are going undercover. And as the agents go down, your ability to engage in effective law enforcement goes down. So our single biggest challenge was to get our agent numbers up. And with the help of a great team that I had at DEA, we were able to double the number of people going through the academy. So we were doubling the number of agents coming out, and we were actually we finally started reversing the negative trend, and started just going into the positive trend of increasing agents. So that was a huge challenge. I'm going to guess that remains a challenge today. Just making sure that we have enough people out there to do the bread and butter work of DEA.
Mm-hmm. And I'll kind of finally ask you about looking at the problem that we have with drugs today, not a lot different, just worse than when you were at DEA. What direction should the agency be taking in today's drug climate?
So I think right now the agency's biggest challenge is Mexico. Our relationship with Mexico, law enforcement relationship with Mexico, has unfortunately deteriorated quite a bit. The Wall Street Journal had an article out a few months ago where they described our relationship with Mexico as being the worst since the assassination, the murder of Kiki Camarena by drug traffickers. Kiki Camarena was a DEA agent. The kidnapping and murder of Agent Camarena in 1985. So think about that. If our relationship with Mexico, our law enforcement relationship with Mexico, is at its worst, worse than it's been in decades, that means that DEA agents can't work in Mexico effectively. They can't work alongside Mexican law enforcement and the Mexican military to attack drug trafficking organizations, to collect the intelligence we need to prosecute drug traffickers. So I would say that the biggest challenge, that the number one issue for DEA, and frankly for the federal government overall, is to reestablish that a solid law enforcement working relationship with Mexico so the DEA can do its job there.
Interesting. And final advice to Chief Raymond Sweeney, who called in with a question, works hard on the ground to keep his community safe. Any words of wisdom for him?
Well, all I can tell you is it's a great team in San Diego, a great DEA team in San Diego. I know at least one or two agents there who work for me in Washington. You've got a great team there. Partner with DEA, put those task forces together. He's in La Mesa, which means he is actually going to see not just local drug traffickers, but he's going to probably see drug traffickers moving drugs all the way from Mexico into the United States. So he's dealing with both a local problem and an international problem. So team with DEA and others to fight those issues. And I'm confident that together you'll be able to succeed.
Thank you. And I want to thank Chief Sweeney too. I very much thank you, Chief Sweeney, for your service. I appreciate you keeping us safe in the emergency department, especially we actually call 911 from the emergency department a few times a month. And you always make us a priority. So I really thank you for that. Thank you, Uttam Dhillon, for your prior service to our country in this fascinating discussion. I appreciate your continued dedication on the issue of drugs. Supply matters. They matter a lot. We can't treat our way out of malaria. We needed to drain the swamps. And now we need to drain the swamp of supply of drugs that's entering our country and killing Americans. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening to High Truths on Drugs and Addiction, where national experts bring you facts and answer your questions. This week's episode would not be possible without the generous support from our sponsor. A sincere and warm thank you to FAF, Families Against Fentanyl. Visit familiesagainstfentanyl.org and sign the petition to declare illegal fentanyl a weapon of mass destruction. Make drug dealers think twice and 3 times before peddling killer drugs. Our producer is Dave Rivas from Davey Boy Productions. I am your host, Dr. Ronit Lev. We hope we brought your day a little bit more high truths.